War, we have military might, economic might, diplomatic might, and the most important actually is willpower. Willpower. The might of willpower. It was what gave Vietnam victory. It was what gave Israel victory. And it is what's going to give Southern Cameroon's victory. Willpower. We have it, we Southern Cameroonians. But in addition to willpower, we need the power of friendly supports, friends, allies. We are proud to say that we have allies in this struggle. We just heard from one, Sylvain Tivor, who spoke from Switzerland. We would now take a moment and hear from another very close friend of Southern Cameroonians. A close friend who believes in our might, in our willpower. He knows, he understands the struggles that suppress, underpress, deprived, marginalized people across the world go through. He has studied insurgencies in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. He is an expert on insurgencies. He has served his nation on many fronts. And he's coming to present to us some thoughts and ideas and reflections on what we can do, how we can take the struggle to the next step. Our dear friend, Grant Newsham, he flew all the way from Hawaii. You may all know that Hawaii is actually farther away from Boston than Europe. In other words, if two planes take off here same time, one flying to Europe, one flying to Hawaii, the plane to Europe arrived first. So we are so delighted, so very pleased to have this very dear friend of ours join us to brainstorm and work together. Thank you.
I suppose I've been involved in the insurgency business or the subject for probably 40 plus years around the world. So that over some time, even I'm going to figure out a few ideas. So that's what I'm going to be sharing, a few ideas, and I'll explain them later. But regarding Southern Cameroon and the nature of the dispute being one over language, in one sense. My mother is actually, she's called Russian or Ruthenian, and it's a tribe of people that lives in the Carpathian Mountains, of where Slovakia, Ukraine, and Poland join. And they have had a country for one day. In 1918, for one day they declared independence. And I'll just move along. So let me jump into my talk right now. Looking at insurgencies, what you find is that most of the focus is on the fighting, actually how an insurgency is fought or how it's fought against. For example, you'll see movies about the Navy SEALs or the Special Forces fighting against insurgents, and that's where the focus goes. But you see very little attention placed on how the insurgency started, why are people unhappy, and then you see even less on how do you end the insurgency. So that's what I want to talk about, is actually how do you go about ending it, and rather than the fighting and that sort of thing. But the fighting is of course important, but I'm going to focus on how is an insurgency endable, and how can you bring, when is an insurgency ready to end? But just before I get to that, I want to mention something because it struck me just recently about how easy it is to avoid an insurgency in the first place, and it takes so little. And it also takes very little to end it in a certain way. But recently I was listening to an interview with he was an African gentleman from Zimbabwe, and he had been one of the best insurgent commanders during the Zimbabwe Revolutionary War. And what he said was, he says, look, when I was like a young teenager, I went into a shop once with one of my friends, and a white man told me to give me his seat. And as a result, he said, well, after that, I started listening to the people who were preaching revolution. And he went on to be a very effective commander. In all of this, there's these small things that lead to insurgency. And one notices, and I'm sure you all know the Southern Cameroon's insurgency better than I do by far. And how often but what I've studied it a little bit, and you see just at the beginning, the beginnings of it were things that could have been stopped very quickly. If someone had just been a little more thoughtful, they could have prevented the entire insurgency. But here we are. So what I'm going to talk about is how is it actually possible to end a war? And what I'm going to do is to share some ideas, because you can actually look at some highlights, and you can do your own assessment of whether or not the Southern Cameroon's insurgency is in fact endable. I don't know if endable is a word, but I will use it. Now the first point that you will hear is are the parties at a stalemate? Are the government and the insurgents, have they reached a point where neither one can defeat the other? That is often a prerequisite to bring an insurgency to an end. Sometimes it takes a long time to reach this point. In Colombia, it took about 40 years. In the Philippines, it still seems to be taking about 70 years to reach that point. In Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, it took about 5 or 6 years to reach it. So sometimes it takes time. So is there a stalemate? And that's an important thing to keep in mind. That's the first thing. Because usually, as long as one side thinks that they can win, they're not going to compromise. They're not going to give up and say, let's make a deal. But once both sides realize they can't continue, that for whatever reasons, then you have a better chance of bringing an insurgency to an end. Now, the next point, and I've highlighted these up here, I'm a minimalist of sorts, but just so you can follow it a little easier, see what the points are. And then you look at what the government's perspective, look at what in this case, say the Cameroonian regime, look at what is their perspective towards the insurgency. Do they think that they can handle it? Do they think that they can just continue with the war as it is and still keep power? And you consider, how far does the government's writ reach? How far does their control go? Do they have the ability to govern in the affected areas? Do schools still operate? Do the police operate? Does commerce go on? Do the markets operate? Do transport services run? Have farmers and businessmen been forced out? Usually, in order to reach to end an insurgency, the government has lost its ability to govern in an area. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Additionally, consider the government's perspective in terms of how much trouble they're facing from elsewhere. They've got problems coming. Are other big nations pressuring them, telling them to stop or to not do what they're doing? Does the government have economic problems that may have something to do with insurgency? They may not, but serious economic problems often make a government feel like it has to negotiate, has to cut a deal. Additionally, sometimes there's just internal political problems where a rival party, a rival group is pressuring the government, and as a result it will have to give up or concede, or it will say want to end the war. You saw something happen like this in Africa, in Angola, Mozambique, and the Portuguese territories, where it was ultimately the change of government in Portugal from the dictatorship to a leftist government who wanted to give away the colonies. that was the cause, that is what led to that it loses its authority, it becomes unstable, and that too can make an insurgency easier to end when the government is having problems. Additionally, you want to look at what the insurgents' situation is. What's going on with the insurgents? What is their capacity to keep fighting? Do they have regular sources of supply, for example, weapons? Are they able to hold their own? Can they take on the government? That's obviously a key point, but also thing to consider is, and the insurgents do, is they look at the state. What is the situation in the territory they control? What does the local population think? Are they tired out? Are they just want the war to end, or are they solidly committed to the insurgents? What are the local expectations? And you find that in the affected areas, the locals always have a pretty keen sense of who's winning or who's probably going to win or who's going to lose. What are their desires? And what I've found probably in every insurgency I've looked at or been involved with, what people want is justice and security. And that is what they're ultimately looking for. So the insurgents are also, they're doing their political analysis of whether or not they're, are the people with them? And that is a very important thing. And where this really it plays out a lot is very often insurgents turn into bandits. That they engage in criminal activity. They extort money from shopkeepers. They set up checkpoints or on the roads to collect revolutionary taxes from the buses. And nobody likes this. So that the insurgents have to consider their own situation. So you consider stalemate, what is the government's position, what are their circumstances, and also what's the insurgents' position? Are they relatively strong, relatively weak, etc.? In Colombia, in South America, one of the reasons why they were able to end the war, at least temporarily, a few years ago, was because the insurgents had become so unpopular and also very weak in certain areas because the government had been fairly effective militarily. So that helped to end the insurgency. So it's not just the government, but the insurgents' position also makes a big deal, aligns with my notes. Now, another thing to consider when you're looking at an insurgency and how you might end it is, you're assessing the situation, is you have to look at geography, because that makes a big difference. And it directly relates to the strength of an insurgency. Particularly, sometimes the insurgency is in such a remote part of the country that the government can just kind of ignore it. It's an unstable place, but it doesn't affect the rest of the country. But also, geography matters because you give it can give the insurgents a cross-border sanctuary, a place where they can go to rest, actually to be safe from attack, a place from where they can receive funding, get training, resupplied, etc. And you saw this in the wars in Southern Africa. For example, Afghanistan was with the border sanctuaries in Pakistan, in Iran, made it very difficult to deal. It gave a huge advantage to the insurgents. So geography really matters. And I think you all know the map of southern Cameroon and Cameroon as well, better than anyone. But that's a thing to consider is how does geography play into this? Are the insurgents able to use cross-border locations, obviously in Nigeria, as a place to get some relief? Are they getting supplied from there? So if they are, that's an advantage for them. If they're not, you can see it's a difficulty. And the absence of these safe havens will often make an insurgent force more willing to concede. But the presence of safe havens also makes it more likely the government will concede because it puts them at a big disadvantage in trying to suppress the insurgency. The thing we look at is we look at the role of external parties, because in the, say, the case of Southern Cameroons, it's the government against Ambazonia liberation groups. But there's other parties that have an influence, that have a sort of a role in the insurgency. And I'm probably speaking in more general terms right now, and that would be other governments. You know, foreign, you could have other governments that either support the insurgents or even support the government. So what is their role in all of this? You know, who are these organizations? What governments? And what are they doing? What sides are they supporting? Also, there's non-governmental organizations that have a big role to play as well. In the Central American insurgencies of the 1980s and into the 1990s, you may remember something called liberation theology. And it was some very radical Roman Catholic elements who were supporting the Marxist, oddly enough, the Marxist insurgents, but it was hugely influential and did prop up and give a lot of support to the anti-government, to the Marxist insurgent movements. Additionally, external groups can play a role in putting sanctions on a government, usually it's on a regime, on a government, that can be very effective as well. Particularly an excellent example of this, once again going back to Zimbabwe, was the sanctions that were put on Rhodesia made it almost impossible for that war to continue. And that led to the ending of the insurgency. South Africa was similarly affected by international sanctions, and that had an effect on the ultimate independence of Namibia as well. So it's the role, what role are external parties play is the thing that needs to be assessed. These days, you're seeing, for example, just as an interesting example, the Chinese, for example, are providing support to insurgents in Assam in eastern India. In Burma, they've been backing the main insurgent army for years now. In Nepal, the insurgency was given direct aid by China. But over the years, it's been the Russians giving aid, it's been the Americans, as everybody knows, have also been backing up sometimes insurgent groups, sometimes America backs a government. So outside parties, the external parties are something that you have to pay attention to, and for anyone considering how to end the insurgency in southern Cameroons, that you have to look at what are the outside organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, what is their role, what pressure are they applying, and also what pressure could they apply to your advantage. That would be the ideal thing. Now, yeah. Okay, now the question of attention is an important one. Because there's insurgencies all over the place, and yet the question to ask, to look at, is how much attention does it receive? And I think we all know the answer with Southern Cameroons. It's not very much. And attention often comes in the form of press coverage. Is it appearing are stories about this appearing in the press? The domestic press, which is rare because governments don't like to report that, but in the international press. And this is a very important thing for an insurgency, because attention is usually bad if you're the government, and it's usually good if you're the insurgents. And the bad attention for a government is when it shows they're not able to control their own country. Attention often is paid to abuses by the security forces, and that's embarrassing for a regime, but it's also embarrassing to countries that are supporting them and for groups that would support them. But and outside pressure groups will use this as well. But attention really is a big deal. But these days, there's not so many foreign correspondents. They used to be all over the place. When you say in the 70s and 80s and a little bit later, you would find these reporters all over the place, and they would be reporting on insurgencies, and you run into them everywhere, but not so much. These days there aren't so many of them. So it's harder to get attention drawn to an insurgency in most cases. But what you do have is the internet. When you have iPhones, you have iPhones and you have the internet. And it used to require a TV camera that cost $250,000 and a crew to run it to actually get some good footage out of an insurgency. These days you need this and Wi-Fi, and that's about it. So it is actually possible to give attention, to draw attention to an insurgency, and that has just changed the dynamic. And governments, of course, don't like this, but it does give an advantage, sort of a practical advantage to an insurgent movement that wants to draw attention to itself. And as you know, it's when you see something with your own eyes, that makes a big difference. It's better than the best written 1,000-word article. It's better than the best speech that you can imagine. Seeing a short clip of something happening leaves an impression on people. Now, also, another thing to consider is brutality. And I use this, not trying to be funny or alarming here, but insurgencies is a rough business. But even with it, considering that a war is never nice, that it is possible to even go too far. And it's the brutality that you see in an insurgency that actually can be, sometimes it can be very, unfortunately, sometimes it leads to particularly outside groups, outside governments taking an interest in the insurgency. You remember that in Boko Haram, when they kidnapped a number of schoolgirls a while during the Obama administration, that at least for a few weeks, Michelle Obama, the First Lady, was leading this crusade to bring back our girls. I think that was their expression. She apparently lost interest after some period of time, but it took this sort of atrocity, this barbarity, to get attention really at the highest levels of the U.S. administration. In Uganda, the Joseph Kony, the United Lords Army, they were well known for kidnapping children, young boys in particular, and this got a lot of attention. Otherwise, I don't think anyone would have paid much attention to what happened in Uganda. Sierra Leone and Liberia, it was just the brutality, which is what led to the parts of the international community, some regional nations, taking an interest in these fights and then trying to do something about it. So this is an issue that you want to look at, is how bloody is the fight. And if you're on the receiving end, one should not hesitate to expose this. But even better, don't do it if it's your own people. But it potentially gives an advantage for somebody trying to end a war. And it can be that this is just so embarrassing for a regime that it makes them want to back off and bring things to an end. Consider the nature of the insurgent movement. And this is important. And what you would do if you would look at it from southern Cameroon's perspective is you look at the insurgency. How many of the groups are there? How many factions are there in this insurgency? Do they get along? Do they fight each other? Or are they rivals? Who are the leaders? Is there one prominent leader? Are there a number of them? Who's actually in charge? Do you have people who are are some of the leaders actually in hiding in the country? Are they across the border somewhere? Are they still in Cameroon trying to work through the political process? So you'll have these different leaders, but think about who are they? Is it a coherent sort of structure, a coherent situation, or is it so disorganized that it seems kind of confused? Are some of them willing to negotiate? Are other of them not? And just want to keep fighting? But ultimately, and one thing when you consider an insurgent's leadership, besides the things I just mentioned, Much depends. It seems that the leaders who get the most attention are the noisiest ones who have access to weapons and soldiers. That often seems to be the way it works. Also, who are the spokesmen for the movement? If you were to say, who is it that speaks for the independence movement? Is there one person, a number of them? Who's most influential? Who gets listened to domestically? Does anyone get international attention? Are there religious figures who sort of have a role? In South Africa, it was Desmond Bishop Tutu, who had an immense influence in the country, but particularly overseas. Also ask, how well organized, this all gets to what I just said, is how well organized is the insurgent movement? Is it confused? Is it something that nobody quite knows what the structure is? Or is it fairly well understood? And if in the areas that it controls, how well does it govern? Does it provide services? Does it sort of administer courts? Does it allow the schools to operate? And how does the insurgent group administer the places it runs? Or is it just as heavy-handed as the government is in its own way? But one of the interesting questions is how is legitimacy conferred on an insurgent movement? And particularly when there's a number of groups in it, who decides which of these groups is the legitimate one? And I will cite, there must have been 7 or 8 independence group or insurgency groups in the former Rhodesia that became Zimbabwe. Yet of those, there were only 2 that really that got international attention, recognition. And that was Robert Mugabe's ZANU and Joshua Nkomu's ZAPU. But the other ones, just nobody, the West, the Americans in particular, the Europeans, just kind of ignored the others. But these 2 got the attention. And you always wonder, why is that? I don't really know. But once again, I mentioned loud, pushy people with a lot of weapons and soldiers, guerrillas, with help provided by China and Russia, respectively. But there is this one aspect of it, and I don't quite have an answer, just how legitimacy is conferred. So within the Southern Cameroon's insurgency, of the different groups, factions, which ones are considered the most legitimate? Is a question that's worth asking, and why is that? And if there's international recognition to be had, well, who's it from? Why is that? Also, something to look at is what are the business interests in the insurgency? Are there companies that have an interest in the insurgency, either from the government's perspective, or is there some that see the insurgents as the better bet? It's something to ask. It's I like to use a few anecdotes, and you'll see I keep them in Africa if I can. During the independence struggle and war in Rhodesia, that there was a British company called Lonro, which operated up in southern Africa and up in East Africa in particular. It was run by a man named Tiny Rowland. And his farms never got attacked by the insurgents. And everyone else's farms did. And there was a reason why, of course, because he was funding one of the main insurgent groups. It is reported. So this is so that is something to pay to look at when you're considering the insurgency. Is who's considered the most legitimate of the groups. Now, another point to mention, talking about the insurgents, and I've touched on it, is the behavior of insurgents does make a difference, because it's important, because particularly if you read the day-to-day accounts in an insurgency, it's an attack here, a bus stop here, people taken off and murdered, landmine hits trucks, etc., etc. And schools are attacked, and 3 children killed, 12 kidnapped. It's this constant sort of problem, just sort of things every day. And my point is that the behavior of the government troops, the government forces matters, but so does the behavior of the insurgents. And if they are seen as just rapacious and bloodthirsty and hurting innocent people, well, then that affects their domestic support. It affects your potential for getting international support. Particularly if you go, say, for example, go to the State Department, and you say, well, here's the situation, we would like your support. And they say, well, look, aren't these people, these are the insurgents, and they're doing these things, why should we support them? So actually the behavior does matter. It's also, international law requires sort of proper behavior within the laws of armed conflict. Also, I've just been giving some ideas about how you look at the insurgents, but also look at the government as well, because that makes a difference, because the government is trying to, it'd like to destroy the insurgents, but if it can't, then it's got to think about a deal. And in most governments, there's factions. There's some factions that will want to negotiate a deal with the insurgents to stop the war, and then there's others who say, no, we're not going to at all. So look at the factions within the government, and also there's, within the government itself, it has its own opponents. And the war, once again, during the Reagan administration, when they were trying to support the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, where they were supporting the Contras, the people who were the insurgents who were against the Sandinistas, who at one time had been the insurgents. But the Reagan administration faced huge opposition from within the US Congress, with factions that were supporting the Sandinistas, and it also faced huge opposition from non-governmental organizations, religious groups, political groups. So look at the state of the government. Does it have what sort of problems is it facing? What challenges does it face? The Swiss gentleman who spoke this morning mentioned the dictator in Cameroons, and some guy who spends 6 weeks at a time in a 12-star hotel in Geneva. That kind of speaks for itself. But on the Cameroonian side, the government side, what is their, what opposition do they face domestically? Where's the opposition? Where are the potential pressure points? You'll find even in the Soviet Union, in Russia, that there's a lot of opposition actually to what the government does. And with the Russians had to deal with an insurgency in Chechnya. There were a lot of Russians who said, look, we're doing it wrong. We shouldn't be doing what we're doing. We should be doing something different. And also when the Russians were in Afghanistan, despite this being a communist country that murders people at the drop of a hat, there was a lot of opposition to the Russians even being in Afghanistan. So look at the state of the government. It's never as unified or homogeneous as you think. So those are a few points to keep in mind when you're doing your assessment. Now, here's something next thing that I'd like to look at is the question of international interest. And this is something that perplexes, I'll bet, everyone in this room. And it perplexes me, and that's why do some insurgencies get a lot of attention and then others get none at all? I don't quite have I don't really have the idea, but some of the things that come down to it is sometimes there is some serendipity to it, but some of the reasons why an insurgency gets attention from big countries or even little countries, but countries that matter and I'll just look at it from the US perspective. Sometimes it has a lot to do with location. The location sometimes matters. Now, if it was an insurgency in Mexico, that would be a lot easier to grasp than one that's 7,000 miles away. And as others have mentioned, sometimes to some Americans, Africa seems like a place of sort of you can't understand it. It's far away, and there's always problems, and so it's nothing to do. But location does make a difference, and I think that actually the skin color does make a difference. That, you know, it seems to be, from as near as I can tell, from U.S. government and academia and elite perspectives, that sometimes it's okay to, if depending on who's killing who, you know, sometimes it doesn't make a difference. You know, once again, I would once again would go back to the Zimbabwe case, that the Rhodesian government was just regularly savaged for its how it was fighting the war, and then 2 years later, Robert Mugabe sends the 5th Brigade into Matabele land, murders up to 20,000 Matabele, and nobody says a word. It was as if nobody cared. Rwanda, more recently, it was, you know, this was allowed to happen when it could have been put to a stop. And so it kind of does, I think it does make a difference sometimes. Unfortunately, that should not be the case, but it is, I think, the current reality. Sometimes there's a financial interest or commercial interest that a government has in an area, and thus they will overlook some things that a government does, or they might support insurgents, etc. But financial, commercial interest makes a difference. Academia sometimes takes an interest, but it's never quite clear exactly why they do, as near as I can tell. The one thing you notice is that in college campuses, you'll often see these pictures of Che Guevara in T-shirts with Che's picture on it, and yet he's popular. So if you're sort of an authorized insurgent group, that'll get you sometimes academia will like you because you're authorized. You know, that's, once again, I think the reality. But often the U.S. government seems that it thinks it's making a cold-hearted calculation of if something is in its interest or not. It doesn't, is it going to take a lot of effort? Is it going to take political capital? And they say that's how they make the distinction, but I don't quite know how that works. You know, because they went into Kosovo, for example, and bombed the daylights out of Serbia. And yet the Kurds have never gotten favorable treatment from the Americans. The argument, of course, is, well, we don't want to upset the Turks, et cetera, et cetera. If there's, over the last 20 years or so, if there was any way to tie an insurgency group to Al-Qaeda, that would get people's attention. And you know, so that's, it's part of the dynamic. Often you will hear on the US side, well, it's not our area, that's somebody else's responsibility. And you see this in the South Pacific, in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, where there have been insurgencies, that the Americans think, well, that's the Australians' territory, so we don't have to do anything. And yet, so that is how the thinking seems to go. Sometimes you will even have religious groups that can take an interest in a fight somewhere. And that was part of the dynamic in Afghanistan, the Charlie Wilson era. That was the Afghan war before this most recent 20-year one. There were Christian groups in the U.S. that actually pushed to provide support to the Mujahideen. And as I've mentioned, you also saw it in Central America in the Reagan era, pushing in support of leftist groups. But religious groups can make a difference. But I have a quote that I want to read. It's I just got it the other day from a friend of mine. I was talking about this, and particularly when he was talking, he was talking in the context of Somaliland, which is a really well-run sort of slice of what used to be Somalia, that has had some international recognition but isn't enough. And we were talking about why is it that the Americans, for example, won't pay attention there. And this is, I'll read the quote, and it'll give you, I think, a pretty good sense of things. This is what he said. I don't know the Department of State's mindset today, but when I spoke to the DCM, that's the number 2 in the embassy in, I won't say where, but it was an African country. When I spoke to the DCM in blank 10 to 12 years ago, he justified American policy by saying, recognizing Somaliland will send a destabilizing message. He said the United States supported the unity and territorial integrity of nations. And And then my friend went on, when I brought up our support for Kosovo independence, he responded that the Serbs had shown they could not govern Kosovo responsibly. He went on to talk about America's traditional support for self-determination. So you figure that out. And there's a little more. My friend wrote, I was called away before I could ask two follow-on questions. One, why is Somaliland denied self-determination? And two, did he believe Mogadishu's warring clans had demonstrated that they could govern all of Somalia responsibly? Of course, I am assuming he would have answered. So that, I think that quote gives you a sense of how the convoluted thinking that, certainly inconsistent thinking that you will find within parts of the US government when it comes to insurgency and which ones get attention and which don't. Now, the thing that you need when you're trying to end an insurgency is it seems that the presence of statesmen is what I would call these, when I say statesmen, I mean these are individuals who for some reason are able to rise above the resentments and the hatreds that most people involved in an insurgency have. And they've got a certain authority, either moral authority or otherwise, and they're the ones who are able to take steps to bring it to an end. And so you always ask yourself when you're trying to end an insurgency, where's the statesman? Where's these guys, say, who have the nerve to stop it? And they don't. There are some examples. They do exist, and they often do surprise you. In South Africa, when that system ended, and it was fighting an insurgency, that it was F.W. de Klerk, I would say, and Nelson Mandela, who were the statesmen who could bring this thing to an end. Additionally, Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland insurgency, it was the two of the strangest characters on the planet, both of them pretty bloodthirsty. One was Reverend Ian Paisley, the other was Jerry Adams, the head of the IRA. But these guys said, okay, we're going to end it. And somehow they played the role of statesmen and brought these things to an end. They did things that nobody could ever imagine could have been done. So if you're going to end an insurgency, sometimes you really do need to have, or if you want to end it a little more easily, the statesmen really make a difference. And you'll know who they are if they exist. Additionally, sometimes it requires outside pressure to get these statesmen to act like statesmen. Sometimes it requires not just pressure, but also offering incentives. So that is part of the dynamic. Now, also you'd want to consider, if you're thinking about ending a war, what kind of deal is possible? And who wants what? On each side, what is it they want? And can you put these interests together and actually make it into sort of an agreement? Can it be for give autonomy, even allow independence, etc. But often I think what it requires here, to make a deal, it requires people on both sides, but usually it's the government. They have to be willing to give up some power and share wealth. I think those two things, and be willing to make sure that justice and security is thrown in. But it's that giving up power and sharing wealth, which is the fundamental requirement. But so you ask yourself, is it even possible to make a deal? Assuming that everything else I've talked about is okay, it should be possible. But as long as one side thinks that it can get everything without conceding anything, then it's very difficult. Now I wanted to mention this part because when people talk about insurgencies, the word "the people" is thrown around all the time, and as if the people is like he's the people or I'm the people. But you think about the word, and when you're trying to understand an insurgency, and insurgencies are all about people, is that you have to ask yourself, well, which people are you talking about, and what is their view of the insurgency? Do they want to keep it going? Do they want to stop it? Do they want to cut a deal? What is it? But which people? Is this urban people, rural people? Is it rich people, poor people, people in the middle? People of a certain religion, people of a certain ethnic group, people who speak a certain language or even a certain dialect of a language, people of a certain generation, educated people, is it intellectuals, academics, is it businessmen, it's big businessmen, or the guy who runs the guy or gal who runs the street corner shop or sells plantains on the corner. And which people are you talking about? You really have to have a good understanding of that to assess your prospects. If you're trying to end the war, which groups are most interested in ending it, which ones want it to keep going, etc., etc. So that is something to consider. And also, one of the peculiarities of an insurgency is that you'll often find that within the government side, the regime side, there's often people who either sympathize with or else support the insurgent's position. And on the insurgent side, you will often find people who don't really like the insurgents very much and are happy enough with the government. They, of course, aren't likely to say it very often, and vice versa. But this is something also to keep in mind, that when the complexity of any insurgency, it has to be well understood in order to figure out how you're actually going to end it. Linger on this, but so if somehow you can end an insurgency or get people to agree to at least talk about an agreement, there's certain things that you have to do. There's the mechanics of it. You declare a ceasefire, you separate the forces, you disarm them, you make sure the security forces are behaving a certain way, etc., etc. You have to give former combatants jobs and that sort of thing. But and once again, it's almost a menu that you go down of the things that you do. But you're fortunate if you get to this point where you actually think you have to do this, it's because a lot of other good things have happened. But I'm just putting this in just for information. But the one part that is important is a peacekeeping force. Sometimes if you can bring outsiders in, they can help establish some confidence between parties that otherwise hate each other because of what's been going on. But how do you get a peacekeeping force to come in? Once again, that goes back to the question of how much attention, how much interest is there in your situation. But peacekeeping forces can be very useful. Sometimes they're brought in just because of so much savagery has been going on, but not always. Sometimes they're brought in before things have gotten too bad. And sometimes they stay for a long time. East Timor, for example, the UN peacekeeping force was there for, goodness, it must have been a decade or so. But it is a function of interest and attention. So if you can get the interest and attention in your insurgency, then you have a better chance of getting a peacekeeping force in. It does help if the peacekeeping force behaves better than criminals, which isn't always the case. One of the things that I would note is that, and I've seen it happen, is that if you can get an insurgency to where it's endable, and you can get it to where it ends, or at least the shooting mostly stops, and there's an effort to get to life at normal, what you sometimes see is the international community, the powers that should play a role, they lose interest, and sometimes they lose interest very fast. And it's a phenomenon, but one needs to do their best to avoid it. Where I first noticed it was, besides the world turning a blind eye to Robert Mugabe after 1980, but after very early 90s, when the Russians had left Afghanistan, and then eventually the Russian installed regime had been overthrown. At that point, every American organization and agency pulled out of Afghanistan so fast that I don't know how you would measure the time. They couldn't get out fast enough. And that allowed a vacuum to be created that led to renewed civil war. And Everything that has happened in Afghanistan, that has happened with Al-Qaeda, happened, I would argue, as a result of the Americans in particular pulling out of the country as soon as they could. They had done everything they could to trash the place, and then they left as fast as they could. And yes, maybe the Afghans could have cooperated more, but that's not really their thing. I was talking to a friend, this was in the mid-2000s, so some years after that, and he was actually a former Marine officer, and he was an Afghan, one of the very few. And I was talking to him, and I said, look, after everything that's happened, think of it. And I said, we were paying $400 million a year during the Charlie Wilson War. And I said, if we could have just kept that up, used it for development, et cetera, we could have avoided all of this. And he says, no, it would have only taken $40 million a year. And the point is that you can get everything right, and then if the powers that can help bring some stability after a war is end the war, then stabilize it. If they lose interest too fast, and they sometimes do have short attention spans, that is just a danger that you have to be worried, to be concerned about. So my last point here is and I say, you all know Southern Cameroon's not just better than Ireland, just you guys know it. I don't. But what I would note, just looking at the situation, as I understand it, is that, and looking at it from the insurgents' perspective and the independence movement's perspective, that some of the things that are worth paying attention to, what I think is the need for unity within the insurgent movement. If it's too factionalized, too argumentative, fractious, that's not good. But the more it can unify, the better it is, the more that there's a statesman. If you can get a few people who is the voice of, say, of Southern Cameroons, ideally, who knows how many, but obviously if it's too many, that's not good, but who are the statesmen that you need? And then a lot of this, this insurgency, in fact, every insurgency is not just a military fight. In fact, if it's just a military fight, its chances are not very good. But there's a political warfare aspect to it, and it's a political battle. And there's a propaganda aspect to it too. And propaganda in the original good meaning of the word, when the Jesuits first used it, was just explaining yourself. It's you're able to explain your position, what you want, and what your platform is. And if you've got this in a coherent message that you can deliver to the right people in the right ways, then that will give you a huge advantage. And you keep it, it's like selling something, selling cornflakes. You deliver the same message, similar messages over time in different ways to the right audiences that you want to influence. But you have to pay attention to the political warfare effort. And that actually, this kind of seminar is one sort of an event that you can use effectively. But successful insurgencies always have a political warfare propaganda component to them that is as important as the actual military fight. Also, the question of how you govern in the territories you control. Are you seen as the honest, the reliable force that can govern properly? That is, of course, important. Is the insurgency involved in corruption, in criminality? That needs to be avoided at all costs. And it requires a certain discipline, of course. So these are just some ideas. One thing I would note, that insurgencies do take an awful, it's rare that they, like you think of it on Thursday and it's done by Monday. It often takes a long time. It's easy to despair, but they often do take a long time. One would like them to take place within one's lifetime, to finish within one's lifetime, but the fact something takes a while is not necessarily, believe me, it's not unusual, but it is something that does have patience and persistence. And one often, and as I said, what people want ultimately, I don't think this is any different, anyone that I've ever seen, They want justice, security, and some opportunity, and to be treated fairly. And I have never met anyone who did not want that. I've met plenty of people who don't want to treat people that way, but I've never met people who want anything other than that. And that ultimately is what a sort of what's called a good insurgency is all about. And when one thinks about how easy it would have been to avoid all of this, when you almost want, if you weren't an adult, you'd probably cry. But it's how it is. But so I really appreciate the chance to come and talk to you all. And you say share some ideas is what I would put it. Give it hopefully some ideas about how you can assess your own situation, what you might do. So I really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you very much.
Can we hear your question?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Speaker did a great job with analyzing the situation, which in conflict studies terms are called mutual hurting stalemates, an intervention. But I'm a little worried about the choice of language he used. In the concept of insurgents or insurgency or insurgent groups, insurgent movements. At one time, he even mentioned Southern Cameroon's insurgency. My worry is whether the speaker will be able to address that kind of language with respect to the Southern Cameroon's war of independence. He did cite cases of Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, Angola, etc. And I'm worried because we're talking about intervention to bring peace. In such great analysis on the literature of mutual hurting stalemates, will perceptions not matter a lot, especially when we use the kind of language the speaker has used in referring to a people fighting in self-defense to restore their independence, which was voted for at the United Nations General Assembly, which is nothing that anyone can compare to Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, Angola, or some of the examples he used. My question therefore is whether he can address the context of the language he used a lot in terms of insurgency. Was he just talking in general terms, or was he referring to the Southern Cameroon's question? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the observation. When I was using the term insurgent, I was, of course, speaking about insurgencies in general. That's fine, but the language does matter. I was using it in a general sense to apply to an insurgency, all insurgencies, and at least in the contexts and the places I'm familiar with, we use the word on both sides. It actually doesn't have a positive or a negative connotation to it, but I understand. The expression freedom fighter is much preferred in some quarters. Speaking from the American perspective, that Americans were considered insurgents until we won, at which point we became, the patriots. But say it's a linguistic question. I was using it in somewhat of a generic term, not suggesting that there was any not to equate, say, the Southern Cameroonian insurgents, say, with Joseph Komi's Lord's United Army. They're not the same. It's not the same thing at all. So I was saying I would hopefully, I was not intending to use it with any sort of qualitative meaning to it. but rather to refer to peoples that are, and therefore their armed forces and political forces that are challenging an incumbent regime. And that was the use that I would make of it.
So won't we think that that use of a generic term might impact the way the outside world views the conflict?
It depends on who in the outside world. I would say generally not. Though one could one can overuse the word insurgent, and usually there's better terms to use, particularly as you've noted in the context of an independence movement. That could be once again freedom fighters. I've heard that frequently over the years. That's one. It could be patriots or even just members of the Ambazonian liberation movements or independence movements. So there's a lot of other words to use, and it's particularly in a systematic or political warfare propaganda effort. One wants to be very careful to choose words properly, to use the right words that are going to have the right meaning, the right significance to the people who are hearing them. So I understand the point very well.
Thank you very much. That was a very powerful presentation, and I really enjoyed it. And one also to commend you from coming from 1,000 miles to be present here. It shows how you, a non-African, a non-Ambazonian, is able to sacrifice your time for our liberation. To follow what His Royal Highness just mentioned, maybe you can educate me and educate the world about this, because La République has successfully tell the world that it is an international, an internal problem, and also stipulating that it is the southern Cameroon. And we know that every country in the world has a southern part. We know that southern Cameroon, as the name goes, La République has intelligently used that southern Cameroon to deceive the world that it is the southern Cameroon of the Cameroon, which these are two different countries. The southern Cameroon that we talk about is the British southern Cameroon, because there used to be the British northern Cameroon. How can you help us educate the world that the deception that La République has continuously to use this appellation to deceive the world that it is an internal issue, that it needs to be resolved internally, which you really understand. Tomorrow would be the 60th anniversary of the British Southern Cameroon independence, which is was the first democratic independent country in Africa. Before French Cameroon got its independence on the 1st of January. So how can you help us? Because our problem, as I see it, is a problem of educating the international community. And if there is any help that we can get out there, is to be able to educate the international community about our identity as Southern Cameroonians, that these are two nations. When you talk of insurgency, it confuses me, because these are separate nations, one invading another one and also usurping its identity. So in this light, how can you help us really educate the world?
Well, I don't know how much I can do. I'm like the Swiss gentleman. I've got limited influence, but as I noted, an independence movement, it needs its political component and the propaganda component, the educational part of it, as a fundamental requirement to work. If there's an armed wing of it, they need to work together, and the better they they work together, the more effective it is. But you have to, as you've noted, sir, you have to explain why, sort of what it is you're about, why you want it, and convince the world of the justice of your position. And I have read things that have been put out, but this needs to be done, let's say, systematically. And you have to, you've got to sort of get the right people involved in it and propagandize it. It's absolute requirement. And since I'm in Massachusetts, I mentioned the Irish Republican Army, which conducted an the Irish have conducted an insurgency against the British for, they would tell you, for 250 years, but certainly for a good 40. And they had a very effective propaganda arm to the point that most of their funding came from Boston and New York. But they would educate the Irish American communities on the struggles, et cetera, but it is that educational approach that is required in order to sort of influence the right governments, the right organizations around the world. And that public relations isn't quite the right word, but it is getting the word out. But in Southern Cameroon's case is particularly important, as you've noted, because that distinction between, to point out that this is not guys trying to break away from Cameroons, but rather people who never wanted to be part of it in the first place. But clearly articulating that is essential. And say, for example, if you go to Capitol Hill, that if you can, you do meet, say, staff members or interested congressmen, if you get a one-pager that lays this out, so when people hear Southern Cameroons, they think, oh, independent country. You want that to be the first thing they associate with. But it does require getting the message out in the right way. And there's no simple way to do it, but but a lot of it is kind of commonsensical, that you put the message in a form that the person you want to hear it is going to hear it and internalize it very quickly, and ideally do something about it.
Thank you very much.
As far as the Africa thing, when I talk about Mugabe killing 20,000 Matabele, I was in Matabele land for part of that time, so I have an opinion about it, and the world didn't care. So I do have an opinion about that sort of thing, and I would say it should be stopped, regardless of if any U.S. government or anyone has any interest in the place. We stop it because we don't allow that sort of behavior. Would be my position. But thank you very much.
Bias or slant language is that the use of those words like beer is fond of. He said when he was announcing the invasion of Southern Cameroon that he was attacking secession. Part of his country was seceding, and terrorism. That there was terrorism in the northwest and southwest. And since the events started, you often hear from East Cameroon about secessionists and terrorists and extremists and words like that. Those are biased words. Those are slant words. Those are meant to persuade people to see the problem from a certain angle, a biased angle. But in language used ordinarily, we have to look both in the context of what the person is saying, and we can sort out what is biased and what is not biased. And I can say that the present speaker was not using the topic he's spoken on from a biased position. No. Thank you very much for your
Mr. Newsham, thank you so much. Your presentation has been quite timely.
Hail this land of glory, we the Ambazonia, pledge our loyalty. Praise the soul of Savior who granted us never to fall. Here in a nation flowing with earth and holy. Glory, glory, glory to the Father for making you a nation, a joy forevermore. Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meeting our need. And your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God being the watchman of this nation. Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meeting our need. And your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God being the watchman of this nation.